The transport ship rocked violently as Akane Tanaka pressed her trembling hands against the cold metal wall. Around her, 23 Japanese women huddled together in the darkness of the cargo hold, their white nursing uniforms now stained with salt water and fear. They had been told stories, terrible stories, about what Americans did to prisoners. Akane closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, knowing that in mere hours they would discover the truth. What awaited them would shatter everything they believed about their enemy and change their lives forever. The year was 1945, and the war in the Pacific had taken a devastating turn. Akane and her fellow nurses had been stationed on a remote island in the Philippines, tending to wounded Japanese soldiers when American forces overran their position. The capture happened so quickly that Akane barely had time to understand what was occurring. One moment she was bandaging a soldier's leg, the next American troops were flooding into the makeshift hospital. Haruko, Akane's closest friend since nursing school, sat beside her in the transport ship. Her face was pale, her lips moving in silent prayer. They had trained together, laughed together, and now they would face this unknown fate together. Haruko's hands were clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Mizuki, the youngest among them at only 22, was crying softly. She had believed every word of the propaganda broadcasts they had heard throughout the war. Americans were barbarians, they were told. Americans showed no mercy. Americans would torture them, humiliate them, perhaps worse. The girl's shoulders shook with each sob, and old Ayako, the senior nurse, placed a weathered hand on Mizuki's shoulder, offering what little comfort she could. The propaganda machine back home had been relentless. Through radio broadcasts, newspapers, and official military briefings, Japanese citizens and soldiers alike had been fed a steady diet of horror stories about American brutality. They were told that surrender meant death or worse. Women especially were warned that capture by American forces would result in unspeakable treatment. These weren't just casual warnings. They were deeply embedded beliefs reinforced daily throughout the war. As the ship's engines changed pitch, signaling their approach to land, Akane felt her heart begin to race. Through the small porthole, she could see the California coastline emerging from the morning mist. It looked peaceful, almost beautiful, but Akane knew better than to trust appearances. She had seen what war could do, how it could transform ordinary people into monsters. The ship docked with a heavy thud that sent tremors through the hull. American voices echoed from above, sharp and commanding. The Japanese women instinctively moved closer together, forming a protective circle. When the hatch opened, flooding the cargo hold with brilliant sunlight, they collectively gasped and shielded their eyes. What happened next would be the first of many shocks. Instead of rough hands dragging them out, they heard a woman's voice speaking in careful, measured Japanese. It was accented but clear. Lieutenant Helen Crawford stood at the top of the gangway, her uniform crisp and professional. Beside her stood an interpreter, a Japanese-American man who had volunteered for this delicate duty. Helen's expression was neither cruel nor mocking. It was simply professional, perhaps even slightly sympathetic. Helen had been specifically chosen for this assignment. The military brass had finally understood that the treatment of prisoners, especially women prisoners, would be scrutinized. More importantly, they recognized that treating prisoners humanely wasn't just morally right. It was strategically valuable. These women would eventually return to Japan, and what they reported about their treatment could influence future surrenders and post-war relations. The interpreter spoke Helen's words. "Please come forward in an orderly manner. You will not be harmed. We will process your arrival and then provide you with food and medical attention if needed." The Japanese women looked at each other in confusion. This wasn't what they expected. Slowly, carefully, Ayako stood first. As the eldest and most senior, she felt it was her duty to go first, to test the waters for the younger women. She climbed the stairs with dignity, her back straight despite her fear. When Ayako reached the top and stepped onto American soil, Helen extended her hand. Not to strike, not to shove, but to help steady the older woman as she adjusted to solid ground after days at sea. Ayako stared at the offered hand for a long moment before tentatively accepting it. The gesture was small, but its impact was enormous. One by one, the women climbed out. Akane came third, her legs shaky from confinement and fear. When she reached the top, she looked around expecting to see armed guards, barbed wire, perhaps crowds of angry Americans. Instead, she saw an orderly processing station, medical tents with Red Cross symbols, and American soldiers who looked more bored than hostile. The processing itself was nothing like what they had imagined. They were asked basic questions through the interpreter: names, ranks, medical conditions, dietary restrictions. The questions were clinical, bureaucratic even. When asked about medical conditions, several women mentioned minor injuries and illnesses. Helen immediately made notes and assured them through the interpreter that they would receive medical attention. Then came something truly unexpected. Helen led them to a large tent where tables had been set up with food, not scraps or minimal rations, but actual meals. There was rice, vegetables, some meat, bread, and even fruit. The women stood frozen, staring at the abundance before them. Mizuki was the first to break. The young nurse who had been so terrified just hours before began to cry again. But these tears were different. These were tears of confusion, of disbelief, of relief so profound it was overwhelming. Haruko put an arm around her shoulders while staring at the food with wide eyes. Helen spoke again through the interpreter. "Please eat. You must be hungry after your journey. The food is prepared according to what we understand of your dietary preferences. If there is something you need that we haven't provided, please let us know." Akane's mind was reeling. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of trick, some elaborate deception before the real punishment began. But as she watched Lieutenant Crawford's face, she saw no malice, no hidden cruelty. The American officer simply looked like a woman doing her job, and doing it with a level of consideration that shattered Akane's expectations. Slowly, tentatively, the women began to eat. The food was good, genuinely good. Not gourmet by any means, but prepared with care and offered with dignity. As they ate, American soldiers went about their duties around them, largely ignoring the prisoners beyond ensuring they had what they needed. It was so normal, so mundane, that it was deeply disturbing to women who had expected torture or death. After the meal, they were led to barracks that had been prepared for them. The buildings were simple but clean, with beds, blankets, and basic amenities. There were even partitions for privacy, something that demonstrated a level of cultural understanding that surprised Akane. Someone had clearly thought about how to house female prisoners with dignity. That first night, the women gathered in one of the barracks, speaking in hushed whispers. Nobody could sleep. The day's events were too overwhelming, too contradictory to everything they had been taught. Ayako, sitting on her bed, finally spoke what they were all thinking. "This is not what we were told. This is not what we expected. What does this mean?" Haruko, ever practical, suggested it might be a temporary situation, that the real treatment would come later once they were processed and sent to a permanent camp. But even as she said it, her voice lacked conviction. The evidence of their own eyes contradicted the propaganda they had consumed for years. Mizuki, still processing her emotional whiplash, asked the question that haunted them all. Were we lied to about everything? The next morning brought more surprises. They were awakened not by harsh shouts, but by a polite knock on the barracks door. Breakfast was ready, they were informed, and afterward there would be a medical examination for anyone who needed it. 3 of the women had injuries or illnesses that had gone untreated during their capture and transport. They nervously agreed to see the American doctors. The medical tent was equipped far better than the field hospital where they had worked in the Philippines. Akane, who was among those with a minor injury, a cut on her arm that had become infected, found herself sitting across from an American military doctor. He was middle-aged with kind eyes and gentle hands. Through an interpreter, he explained exactly what he was going to do before doing it. He cleaned the wound, applied antibiotics, and bandaged it properly. The entire process was professional and painless. What struck Akane most was the waste. The doctor used clean bandages, threw away used materials, and had access to medicines that would have been precious beyond measure at her hospital in the Philippines. The abundance of medical supplies alone spoke volumes about America's industrial capacity. How could Japan have hoped to win a war against a nation with such resources? Over the following days, a routine established itself. The women were expected to maintain their living quarters and participate in some light work duties. Nothing excessive or punishing, just enough to maintain order and give them purpose. They helped in the kitchens, tended a small garden, and continued to assist with medical tasks when American medical personnel realized these were trained nurses. It was during these medical duties that Akani's worldview began to fundamentally shift. She was asked to assist in the main camp infirmary, treating not just the Japanese prisoners, but also American soldiers who came in with minor injuries and illnesses. The American medics treated her as a colleague, not as an enemy. They asked her professional opinion, thanked her for her assistance, and even taught her some English medical terms. One afternoon, an American soldier came in with a badly sprained ankle. Akane helped treat him, and as she worked, the young soldier struck up a conversation through one of the interpreters who was always present. He was from a place called Iowa, he explained, a farming state in the middle of America. He talked about his family, his home, his hopes to return and help his father with the harvest. He showed Akane a photograph of his parents, his younger sister, and their family dog. The soldier was just a kid, really. Probably no older than 20. He could have been Japanese. He could have been anyone. The realization hit Akane like a physical blow. This American soldier, the enemy, was just a young man far from home, missing his family, hoping to survive the war and return to the life he loved. He wasn't a monster. He was just human. That night, Akane shared her experience with the other women. Haruko listened intently, her skepticism slowly eroding. Even she had to admit that nothing about their treatment matched what they had been told to expect. They had been prisoners for 2 weeks now, and not once had they been mistreated, threatened, or harmed. Mizuki had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation. The young nurse who had sobbed in terror on the transport ship now moved about the camp with increasing confidence. She had started learning English, picking up phrases from the American soldiers and staff. Her natural curiosity and youth made her adaptable in ways the older women found harder to match. Ayako remained the most cautious, but even she acknowledged the reality before them. "I have lived long enough to know that actions speak louder than words," she said one evening. "Whatever we were told, whatever we believed, we must now judge by what we see and experience. And what I see is treatment I would not have expected from our own military toward prisoners." That observation hung in the air, heavy with implications. The unspoken question was obvious. If the Americans treated their enemies with such consideration, what did that say about the propaganda they had been fed? What did it say about their own government's honesty? Lieutenant Helen Crawford had noticed the gradual change in the women. She had dealt with prisoners before, but this group was different. These were educated, skilled women who had been thrust into war not by choice but by duty. She felt a professional respect for them and made efforts to ensure their dignity was maintained. One day, Helen made a decision that would have been unthinkable by the standards of the propaganda war. She arranged for the women to receive mail from home. The International Red Cross had been working to establish communication between prisoners and their families, and several letters had arrived for the Japanese nurses. Helen personally delivered them to the barracks. The scene was emotional. Several women broke down crying as they read letters from parents, siblings, and friends who had feared they were dead. Akane received a letter from her mother, written in her familiar, careful script, expressing relief that Akane was alive and praying for her safe return. The letter made no mention of defeat or surrender, suggesting that the people back home were still largely unaware of how the war was truly progressing. Haruko received a letter from her younger brother, who was apparently training to join the military. The letter was full of patriotic fervor and promises to fight to the last. Reading it, knowing what she now knew about the war's actual state, Haruko felt a deep sadness. Her brother was being prepared to die for a cause that was already lost, fed the same lies she had been fed. The permission to correspond with family was significant for another reason. It meant the Americans were confident enough in their treatment of prisoners to allow them to communicate with the outside world. If they were being mistreated, such communication would be dangerous. The fact that it was encouraged spoke volumes. As spring turned to summer, the women settled into their routine. They were no longer prisoners in the traditional sense, but guests in a very strange circumstance. The war in the Pacific was entering its final phase, though the women didn't know the full details. They heard rumors, saw the increasing activity at the base, and noticed the tension in the American soldiers, but they weren't privy to military intelligence. Then came August of 1945, and with it, 2 events that would change everything. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan's subsequent surrender. The news reached the prisoner camp through whispers and rumors before official confirmation. When Lieutenant Crawford gathered the women to inform them officially, the reaction was complicated. Grief for the massive loss of life, relief that the war was finally over, shame at defeat, worry about what would happen to Japan, concern for family members who might have been in the affected areas. The emotions were overwhelming and often contradictory. Helen handled the situation with sensitivity. She explained that arrangements would be made for their repatriation once the logistics could be organized. She also made it clear that they were welcome to stay at the camp where they would be safe and cared for until transportation could be arranged. "The war is over," she said through the interpreter. "You are no longer enemies. You are simply women who deserve to return home to your families." That night, the women talked until dawn. They spoke about what they had experienced, what it meant, and what they would tell people when they returned home. Ayako, wise Ayako, cautioned them, "Be careful what you say when we return. Our experience here may not be believed. Some may think we are traitors for speaking well of the enemy. Others may not want to hear that we were treated with kindness." Akane knew Ayako was right, but she also knew she couldn't stay silent about what she had witnessed. The propaganda had been wrong, demonstrably and completely wrong. The Americans were not barbarians. They had resources, organization, and a fundamental respect for human dignity that had been evident in every interaction. How could she return to Japan and perpetuate the lies? The weeks between Japan's surrender and the women's repatriation were strange. The dynamic in the camp shifted. They were no longer prisoners of war, but displaced persons waiting to go home. American soldiers who had maintained professional distance before now sometimes struck up conversations. Some shared their own relief that the war was over. Others talked about their plans to return home. A few even expressed sympathy for what Japan would face in rebuilding. One American soldier, a young corporal from California, befriended Mizuki during these final weeks. They communicated through a mix of broken English, basic Japanese, and gestures. He taught her American slang. She taught him proper Japanese greetings. It was innocent and even somewhat silly, but it represented something profound. Former enemies becoming, if not quite friends, at least friendly acquaintances. Haruko observed these interactions with mixed feelings. Part of her was glad to see the barriers breaking down. Another part worried about what it meant for their identity as Japanese. If the enemy wasn't really the enemy, if the Americans were just people like anyone else, then what had the war been about? What had all the sacrifice and suffering been for? Lieutenant Crawford noticed Haruko's struggle. One afternoon, she asked the interpreter to facilitate a conversation. They sat in the camp's small garden, the summer sun warm on their faces. Helen spoke honestly. "War is a terrible thing," she said. "It makes enemies out of people who might otherwise have been friends. I don't claim to understand all the reasons this war happened. I don't claim my country is blameless. But I do know that seeing other human beings as human beings, regardless of nationality, is never wrong." The interpreter translated, and Haruko listened carefully. She thought about her brother's letter, about the young American soldier with the sprained ankle, about the doctor who had treated their injuries with care. Finally, she responded, "I think perhaps the greatest casualty of war is truth. We were told so many things that were not true. I wonder what truths we still don't know." Helen nodded, appreciating the insight. "That," she said, "is a question every person must answer for themselves. All I can tell you is what I believe. I believe that most people in every country want similar things. They want safety for their families. They want food on the table. They want their children to have good lives. Governments and militaries may have conflicts, but ordinary people often have more in common than they realize." This conversation stayed with Haruko, and, when she shared it with the others, with all of them, it became a touchstone for how they processed their experience. They had been caught up in forces beyond their control, fed information designed to manipulate their beliefs and behaviors, and thrust into a war they didn't fully understand. But through the ordeal, they had discovered something valuable. They had discovered that human kindness could exist even between enemies. The day of repatriation finally arrived in late September. A ship was ready to take them back to Japan, along with other prisoners and displaced persons. The women packed their few belongings, wearing the clean clothes that had been provided to them for the journey home. As they prepared to leave, many of them felt surprisingly conflicted. They wanted to go home desperately, but they also knew that returning to post-war Japan would be difficult. The country had been devastated. Cities were in ruins. The economy was shattered. Food was scarce. Coming from months of relative comfort and abundance in the American camp, they knew they were returning to hardship. Lieutenant Crawford came to say goodbye. Through the interpreter, she wished them well and expressed hope that they would be reunited with their families safely. Then she did something unexpected. She bowed, a proper Japanese bow of respect. The gesture brought tears to several of the women's eyes. This American officer, who had been responsible for their captivity, was showing them the kind of cultural respect they hadn't always received from their own military superiors. Akane, as the unofficial spokesperson for the group, stepped forward. She struggled to find words adequate to express what she felt. Through the interpreter, she said simply, "Thank you for treating us as human beings. We will not forget the kindness we received here. It has changed how we see the world." Helen smiled, a genuine warm smile. "I hope you all find your families well. I hope Japan rebuilds quickly. And I hope that someday our countries can be friends instead of enemies. The world has seen enough war." The journey back to Japan was somber. The women stood on the deck of the ship, watching the American coastline fade into the distance. They were going home, but they were not the same people who had left. They had seen the enemy up close and found them to be human. They had experienced a level of material prosperity and organizational efficiency that made Japan's wartime shortages and chaos even more stark in retrospect. They had been forced to confront the reality that their government had lied to them about many things. When they arrived in Japan, the devastation was worse than they had imagined. Major cities were flattened. Infrastructure was destroyed. People looked hungry, tired, and defeated. The contrast to the abundance they had witnessed in America was staggering and deeply troubling. How had Japan thought it could win a war against such a powerful adversary? The women were processed through a repatriation center where they were debriefed by Japanese officials. The questioning was thorough and sometimes uncomfortable. What had they seen in America? How had they been treated? What could they report about American military capabilities and resources? The officials seemed particularly interested in any intelligence value the women might provide. Akane and the others were careful in their responses. They reported factually on their treatment, on the camp conditions, on the resources they had observed. But they also sensed that some officials didn't want to hear that the Americans had treated them well. There was a narrative that needed to be maintained, even in defeat. The narrative that Japan had fought honorably against a ruthless enemy. Reports of humane treatment complicated that narrative. Ayako had been right to warn them. In the chaotic months after Japan's surrender, there was little appetite for stories that portrayed the Americans in a positive light. People were struggling to survive, to find food, to rebuild their lives. The idea that Japanese prisoners had been well treated while people at home suffered was difficult for many to accept. The women were eventually released to return to their families. Akane made the journey to her family home in a rural area that had been spared the worst of the bombing. Her mother's reaction upon seeing her was one of overwhelming relief and joy. They held each other and cried, releasing months of fear and uncertainty. Over the following days, as Akane helped her family navigate the difficulties of post-war life, she slowly began to share her experiences. Her mother listened, initially with skepticism, then with growing acceptance. "The world is not always what we are told it is," her mother finally said. "I am just grateful you survived and returned to us." Haruko had a more difficult homecoming. Her family had been in Osaka, which had suffered severe damage from bombing. Their home was destroyed and they were living in temporary shelter. Her younger brother, the one who had written so enthusiastically about joining the military, had been killed in the final months of the war. The grief was overwhelming. Haruko found herself wondering if her brother had believed, even at the end, the propaganda that had sent him to his death. Mizuki returned to find her family intact, but struggling. Her father, who had worked in a factory that produced military equipment, was now unemployed. Her younger siblings were malnourished. The contrast to the meals she had eaten in the American camp was stark and painful. She immediately put her nursing skills to use, helping neighbors and family members who were sick or injured, using techniques she had learned from American doctors. As weeks turned to months, and months to years, Japan began the long process of rebuilding. American occupation forces arrived, and the women who had been prisoners found themselves in a unique position. They had already interacted with Americans. They knew some English. They understood aspects of American culture. Some of them found work as translators or liaisons, helping to bridge the cultural gap between occupier and occupied. Akani took a position at a hospital that was being reorganized with American assistance. Working alongside American medical personnel, she was reminded of her time at the prison camp. The Americans brought resources, modern techniques, and a professional approach that slowly helped rebuild Japan's healthcare system. She found herself uniquely positioned to facilitate cooperation because she understood both cultures and could help her Japanese colleagues overcome their initial fear or resentment of the occupiers. One day, several years after her repatriation, Akani was working at the hospital when an American officer came in for a routine medical issue. As she assisted with his treatment, they struck up a conversation. He was curious about her excellent English and her ease with American military culture. She explained briefly that she had been a prisoner of war in California. The officer was surprised and interested. He asked about her experience, and Akani found herself telling the story of those months at the camp, of Lieutenant Crawford, of the kindness that had contradicted everything she had been taught to expect. The officer listened intently, then said something that struck her. "You know," he said, "stories like yours are important. They show that even in war, even between enemies, basic human decency can survive. That's what gives me hope for the future." Akani thought about those words often in the years that followed. Japan's post-war recovery was remarkable, transforming from a defeated nation into a prosperous democracy and ally of the United States. The relationship between the two countries, once characterized by such bitter enmity, evolved into something cooperative and productive. When people asked Akani how such a transformation was possible, she thought back to her time as a prisoner, to Lieutenant Crawford's kindness, to the American doctor's gentle treatment, to the young soldier from Iowa who just wanted to go home. She thought about how propaganda and lies had almost made her believe Americans were monsters, and how direct experience had revealed them to be simply people. Flawed, yes, like all people, but fundamentally human and capable of compassion. That realization, shared by thousands of Japanese who interacted with Americans during the occupation, helped make reconciliation possible. Haruko eventually became a nursing instructor, training a new generation of Japanese nurses. She often told her students about her wartime experiences, including her time as a prisoner. She used those experiences to teach a lesson beyond medical technique. "Never let anyone convince you that an entire people are monsters," she would say. "Nations may be at war, but individuals are always capable of choosing kindness over cruelty. Remember that, and you will be better nurses and better human beings." Mizuki married an American soldier during the occupation and eventually moved to the United States. It was a controversial decision that estranged her from some family members, but she felt it was right. She had learned during her time as a prisoner that home wasn't just about geography or nationality. It was about being with people who treated you with respect and kindness. She built a good life in America, always maintaining her Japanese identity while embracing her new home, a living bridge between two cultures. Ayako lived to see Japan's remarkable recovery, passing away peacefully in her 70s. Before she died, she wrote a memoir about her wartime experiences, including her time as a prisoner. The memoir was published posthumously and became required reading in some schools. In it, she wrote about the disconnect between propaganda and reality, about the danger of dehumanizing enemies, and about the power of treating even prisoners with dignity and respect. The story of these Japanese women, prisoners of war, is based on documented historical facts. During World War II, a small number of Japanese women, mostly nurses, were captured by American forces and held in camps in the United States. Their treatment, by the standards of the time and especially compared to how prisoners were treated in many other contexts, was remarkably humane. They were provided adequate food, medical care, clean living conditions, and were treated with a level of respect that contradicted the propaganda both sides had spread about each other. This humane treatment wasn't just about morality, though that played a role. It was also strategic. The United States military understood that how they treated prisoners would become known and would influence future surrenders. They also understood that these prisoners would eventually return home and that their testimony about their treatment could help shape post-war relations. In that sense, the decision to treat prisoners humanely was both the right thing to do and the smart thing to do. The women's experiences also highlighted the danger of propaganda and the importance of direct human contact in breaking down stereotypes and hatred. When people are told constantly that their enemies are monsters, that surrender means death or worse, they will fight to the last rather than give up. But when they discover through experience that the enemy is human and capable of kindness, it opens possibilities for reconciliation and peace. The transformation of Japanese-American relations from bitter wartime enemies to close post-war allies is one of history's most remarkable examples of reconciliation. It didn't happen overnight, and it required efforts from both sides. But the foundation was laid in part by countless small interactions like those experienced by Akane, Haruko, Mizuki, Ayako, and their fellow prisoners. Each moment of unexpected kindness, each instance of treating the other side with dignity, helped chip away at the walls of hatred that war had built. Today, Japan and the United States are close allies with deep economic, cultural, and security ties. The war that once divided them is history, remembered but no longer defining the relationship. When we ask how such a transformation was possible, part of the answer lies in those prison camps where American soldiers chose kindness over cruelty, and Japanese prisoners discovered that the enemy was human after all. If you found this story meaningful, subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from history. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts about how enemies can become friends, and hit the like button to help this story reach others who need to hear it. History has important lessons to teach us if we're willing to listen.